By thinking can we arrive at understanding. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. There are many places in the Gospels where we see Jesus in open conflict with the Pharisees, that is to say, with man-made as opposed to true mystical tradition. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 15, we see a good example of how they and he locked horns. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees from Jerusalem came and asked Jesus, "Why do your disciples break our ancient tradition and eat their food without washing their hands properly first?" Jesus, after scolding them for their hypocrisy in observing lesser rules so carefully while ignoring the much more important ones, said to them, "Listen and understand this thoroughly. It is not what goes into a man's mouth that makes him common or unclean. It is what comes out of a man's mouth that makes him unclean." It wasn't that Jesus counseled against such wholesome practices as washing one's hands before eating. In an age, however, when lesser rules were given too much importance relative to the truly important ones, cleansing the heart of impure desires, for example, he emphasized the supreme importance of loving God and of communing with Him. The Pharisees, the orthodox religionists of his day, in other words, had brought true religion down to a level of intellectual hair-splitting. They mistakenly considered the way to understanding to lie through a minefield of definitions, which they tried to refine to ultimate exactitude. Jesus thought, however, that the intellect alone can never lead one to truth. Without love, indeed, there is no ultimate verity. Without fixity of purpose, born of the heart's devotion, the intellect wanders endlessly. It cannot settle for long on anything. As the Bhagavad Gita says in the 2nd chapter, the intellects of those who lack fixity of spiritual purpose are inconsistent, their interests endlessly ramified. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind.
Good morning. A couple of weeks ago, I was asked if I would like to do this Sunday service in English today. And of course, I was really happy. It's a rare treat for me, living here in Italy, to be able to do a discourse in English. And so I was very happy to do it. And then I read the reading, and I thought, oh dear, can I really do this topic justice? Because I have to say, in all honesty, I like thinking. I think a lot. I have a very active mind, and for most of my life, I have really liked my mind. You know, when I was a child, I still remember learning to read, and the teachers were saying that I had to limit my reading to a certain level, the 1st grade level, but I wanted to already read books that were more advanced. Curious George comes to mind. And fortunately, my mother was very smart, and she said, "Don't tell my girl what she can read and what she can't read. If she wants to read at that level, let her read." And it just was always, let's say, to my way of thinking, my best feature was having a quick mind that could pick up information elaborate it and remember things, remember what I studied. So when I went to university, I decided to study psychology, which is the science of the mind. And mostly I got into it because I wanted to figure myself out. I wanted to figure out why I had certain difficulties, why I did certain things, thought and felt certain ways. And I learned how to observe myself. I learned how to analyze myself and also interactions with others in trying to help them understand their problems. And looking back, I can see that this was my first foray into the science of introspection, which Yogananda gave a lot of emphasis to as a very important practice, to observe ourselves, especially our reactions and our thoughts, and in this way start to come to an understanding of what our karmic patterns are, what we have developed in the past, tendencies that we have that maybe don't work so well, that we might want to change. So I went through 5 years of university and I loved it. I did really well. I got really good grades. And I was very comfortable in that academic atmosphere. But then when I got out of university, I started to think, maybe there's something else. I could have gone on to get a master's, a doctorate, but I just felt like there was something I was missing in life. And so I started to look for alternatives. And like Jesus says in the Bible, seek and ye shall find. As soon as I started looking, I started to come across spiritual things that I had never even imagined or heard of before. Someone suggested that I learn transcendental meditation, and I found it very helpful. For the first time in my life, I was able to sit still for 20 minutes. And it helped me to calm myself. It helped me to feel less stressed out by the things that happened that were difficult in my life. But I still felt like it wasn't quite enough for me. It's a very good technique, very valid, but I needed something else, but I didn't know what. I came to know a spiritual group in the town I lived in. Again, very, very fine people. Their philosophy was very valid. They had a really good and deep teaching. I enjoyed being with them. But there was something missing. And then finally, somebody gave me Autobiography of a Yogi to read. And within a month after reading that book, I met the person who introduced me to Swami Kriyananda and to Ananda. I met Swami Kriyananda in 1978. He actually came to the place where I lived in Colorado with a group of people. And I bought his autobiography, which at the time was called The Path. Now it's called The New Path. And I read it, and that was the book that really transformed my life. Autobiography of a Yogi was just a little bit too high, too far in the stratosphere for me at that point. Too many things that were just so new I couldn't really absorb them. But in Swami Kriyananda, I finally found a kindred spirit. He was so clear about expressing his own search. Like me, he grew up very, very intellectual. He was brilliant. He was a genius, way beyond my level. But he had the same orientation to the mind, developing the mind, understanding things with the mind. And at the same time, he knew something was missing, and he finally realized, after having left university and trying to find what he was seeking in the arts and other things, especially theater, he realized that what he wanted was God, but he didn't know how to find it, how to find, experience that presence, that divine presence as a living inner experience. And then finally, he found Autobiography of a Yogi. And he knew immediately that Yogananda had what he wanted and that he was the one who could help him in his life. So he traveled, as he says, many times in many talks, 4 days and 4 nights by bus from New York to Los Angeles. He found Yogananda, and one of the things, there are 2 things that are very interesting to me and pertinent to our talk today, to our subject today, in that first meeting. First was, one of the things that Yogananda said to him is, I give you my unconditional love. Will you give me your unconditional love? Now, I had never thought about unconditional love before. What is it? It's just, I love someone or I don't. I love something or I don't. What is this unconditional love? And then, what really struck me as I think back about it, when he accepted the young, his name was Donald Walters, and the master called him Walter for some reason. He was Walter the whole time that the master was alive. When he accepted him as a disciple, he touched him in the heart chakra, not the spiritual eye, but the heart chakra. And he writes, Kriyananda, that the master's hand vibrated like this for a long time, many minutes. And he felt changed within from that moment. So these 2 aspects of that first meeting bring into focus that element that I had been missing without knowing it. And that's devotion, love, opening our heart to God, and also the need for a guide, for a teacher. In Kriyananda's case, in my case, that teacher, that guide, is Paramhansa Yogananda. Now, in the path, after his meeting with Yogananda, the next couple of chapters that Swami Kriyananda, excuse me, I just lost my place. In the next couple of chapters, what Kriyananda talks about most of all is how he knew he wanted to overcome this tendency to be intellectual, and how interested and active the master was in helping him to do that and to find devotion. And I'd like to read just a couple of things that he wrote about this. This is from the path. Mental habits, alas, are not so easy to change as to think about changing. Months passed before I felt that I had made substantial progress against my years-old tendency to over-intellectualize. Master, seeing my desire, helped me from the start with constant encouragement and advice. Get devotion, he would tell me. You must have devotion. Remember what Jesus said. And here he paraphrased the words of the gospel. Thou dost not reveal thyself to the prudent and the wise, but unto babes. And even Sri Yukteswar, Yogananda's guru, who was a Gyan avatar, incarnation of wisdom and discrimination, wrote in his book, The Holy Science, the heart's natural love is the principal thing to attain a holy life. It is impossible for man to advance one step toward salvation without it. Again, Swamiji says, Swami Kriyananda, like most college-trained intellectuals, my notion of wisdom tended to be rather dry. This is familiar to me, perhaps to you. But until the intellect has been softened by heart qualities, it is like earth without water, weighty but infertile. Master was anxious to wean me from this addiction to an arid mental diet, even as I myself was anxious to be weaned. And then he tells one of the most charming stories in his biography, his autobiography, when he often spent time at 29 Palms, the Master's desert retreat, with Yogananda and other disciples. And one night, one evening, he and a brother disciple, Norman, were with the Master in his kitchen. And Yogananda asked them to turn off the lights, so it's completely dark. And he asked one of the other disciples to bring him a little bag. So then Swami Kriyananda Walter heard crinkle, 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 as Master pulled something out of the bag. And then suddenly he saw sparks flaring out. The Master had a little toy pistol that when he pulled the trigger, it would make colored sparks. And of course, the young Walter was totally flabbergasted. He had no idea what in the world. This is an avatar. This is a spiritual giant. What is he doing with this toy? And then Yogananda said to turn on the lights. And he brought out of the bag another little pistol, toy pistol, fired into the air, and his little toy parachute went up in the air and then came down. And the way Swamiji describes it is so cute. He says, Norman and I very gravely, seriously watched the parachute going down. And Master was laughing about this, of course. And then finally, Kriyananda says that the Master glanced at him with a twinkle in his eyes and said, "What do you think of them, Walter?" And he laughed. He wanted to try to get into the spirit of the of the game, and he said, "Oh, they're fine, sir." And then the Master looked deeply into his eyes and said, "Suffer little children to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven." So here's the missing element that I was seeking for a long, long time, even without knowing it, that along with the mind, we have to develop the heart. We have to develop the heart's natural love, the heart's devotion. But I'd like to go back for a moment and look again at the question of the mind, of the thoughts. Because it's not to be taken lightly. Thoughts are a part of our reality, and it's not a bad thing to think. However, we can have positive thoughts or negative thoughts, helpful or not helpful. And the problem is that the nature of the mind is to be restless. It's hard to have control of it. It's hard to kind of grasp onto it. In India, they use, as a symbol of the mind, they use a monkey. Curious, restless, running around, wanting to touch everything. And the mind is like that if we just let it run on its own. Grasping at this thought, grasping at that fact, grasping at that experience. But what are thoughts, really? Yogananda said something that can be quite startling. He said, "Our thoughts are not our own. Thoughts," he said, "are universally rooted." In several of his writings, Swami Kriyananda gives us an image of these universal thoughts. as vast rivers or flows of consciousness through space, through the cosmos. In the book Revelations of Christ, which is a wonderful book, he quotes Sri Yukteswar, who said, "The universe, having been conceived first by consciousness and projected out of consciousness by thought, idea forms, and then by energy, is far more conscious than the mind of man can imagine. Cosmic influences do exist. They flow, indeed, like streams and rivers through the entire universe, influencing even the consciousness of mankind." And in another one of his books, Kriyananda gives us a wonderful visualization. Imagine mighty rivers of consciousness flowing through the universe, sweeping through vast stellar systems, engulfing planets, catching up in swirling currents the little thoughts, ideas, and passions of men. What an image! These huge, vast rivers of consciousness that flow through the universe. But what has this got to do with us? The point for us is this, that our consciousness, our mind, is like a radio receiver. We can turn the dial of our consciousness and we can attune our consciousness to one or another of these flows of consciousness. We have a choice. There's one flow that from our perspective is downward moving, that carries the consciousness into attachment and desires, to identifying with the body, with the material world, with our outer experiences. And it's a very powerful flow, and it's very predominant. Lots and lots of people in this world are tuned into that flow. And then there's another flow that goes upward, which takes us towards higher levels of consciousness, a more refined level of awareness. And the desire, the impulse to align our consciousness with something bigger than ourselves, which we call God. It's up to us to tune the radio of our consciousness. And here again, the heart comes into play, because it's our feelings. The heart is the center of feelings. It's our feelings and our desires that greatly influence which one of these currents we're going to tune into. If our heart is stimulated with desires for experiences, for sense pleasure, for the things of this material world, for outward satisfaction, then this is the flow of energy that we will tune our consciousness to, and it will take us further and further in that direction. If we learn to tune our heart into a higher level of desire, to desire God, to desire true bliss, which doesn't come from things of this world, then we are tuning into that upward flowing current, and it can take us far. It's like getting into a river. Once you're in the center of that river, it'll take you wherever it's going. And if we choose that current, it can take us very quickly into higher states of consciousness, inner freedom, and at the end, bliss. Again, I'd like to tell you a couple of stories from the path. And one of them is one of my favorites. Well, they're all my favorites. I just love them all. This is a story of a very intellectual, probably college professor, university professor, very proud of his intellect. Sounds familiar, right? Who came to see Yogananda, and he came with a long list of intellectual questions. And so he trotted out his first question, very deep, very intellectual, philosophical, hard to understand even. And the master simply said, "Love God." The man was taken aback, didn't quite know what to say, but decided to move on. Went to his second question, also very deep and profound and philosophical, and again, the response, "Love God." Well, this was becoming ridiculous, but he thought, okay, I'll try one more time with another question, even more profound, more philosophical. The master rose to his feet, quite sternly said, "Love God," and walked out of the room. Now, Kriyananda heard months later that this man had been saying to different people that he just really didn't feel like the master understood his questions. Well, of course he understood the questions. But he answered not the questions, but what really was needed by this soul to break out of his intellectual bondage. The other story, which I also really, really like, is when Yogananda was very young. He was still in India. He had graduated from college, so he was about probably 25, 26 years old, and he started a school. And the first location of that school was not healthy, wasn't in a good place, so he asked the Maharaj of Kazim Bazar, to transfer his school to one of the Maharaja's properties in Ranchi. The Maharaja wanted to make sure that Master was what he said he was. So he asked this whole group of pundits to come and test the young Swami to see if he really knew what he was talking about. And young Yogananda turned the tables on them. Remember what he did? He said to them, "Let's not talk about things that we can read in scriptures, but what we have realized ourselves. In the scriptures, it says that there are four aspects of the mind: mon, buddhi, ahankara, and chitta. But the scriptures don't say where these four functions are located in the human body. Can you tell me that?" Of course they couldn't, because they had not had that experience. But the master knew. Mon is here at the top of the head. Buddhi, at the point between the eyebrows. Ahankara, in the medulla oblongata. And chitta, in the heart. What could they say? They were speechless after that. So like Jesus, Yogananda had little patience for self-styled pundits who focus only on the mind and intellectual understanding. So where does that leave us? We've spent a good part of our lives developing the intellect, learning how to think, to learn, to study. What can we do to open this new way towards understanding? We have to find a balance between the mind and the heart, between thought and intuitive perception. And how can we do that? We have a few practical suggestions from Swami Kriyananda and from Paramhansa Yogananda that can be really helpful for this. The first point that I'd like to mention is developing intuition. Swami Kriyananda has written a wonderful book called, with a sort of unfortunate title, Intuition for Starters. The title was requested by the book publishers that commissioned the book from him, because they wanted to appeal to a broader market. But it's not necessarily just for beginners. It is a workbook. It's a textbook for how to develop our intuitive perception and to tune into our inner guidance and follow our inner guidance. It's very, very important. And in this book, Kriyananda talks about the 3 levels of the mind, 3 levels of the consciousness. The subconscious mind, which contains memories, emotions, feelings, and also our karma from the past. The conscious mind, the intellect, which is the part that we've been talking about quite a bit today, and the superconscious mind, that part of our consciousness that's already in contact with the infinite consciousness of God. And then he gives us a very simple technique using 2 chakras, the spiritual eye, positive pole of the 6th chakra, and the heart chakra, the 4th chakra, to tune into inner guidance. What he presents, the technique he presents, is to first meditate a bit to calm our mind, to calm our heart, interiorize our awareness, and then to concentrate deeply at this point between the eyebrows. Yogananda said this is our transmitting station, like a radio transmitter. And to transmit from this point, to offer up a question, whatever it is that we need guidance in that particular moment. And then after some time, he suggests to concentrate in the heart center and listen. Listen sensitively, because the heart is the receiving station. To listen for an answer. Now, that answer can come in many ways. It may come immediately as a thought, an inspiration, a flash. Maybe not. The major part of his book, talks about all the different ways that we can refine the process in order to get clearer responses. It's a wonderful book, and fortunately, I discovered last night, it's available as a Kindle book. So even if you can't find it in a bookstore or order it from the U.S., because right now Crystal Clarity can't ship to foreign places outside the U.S., you can buy that book on Kindle, and I really, really recommend reading it and practicing it. It's very, very effective and very helpful. So that's the first thing that we can do. We can work on developing our intuition. And this is something to do regularly, every day, because it's by practice that we get better and better at it. This is something that Kriyananda said. The more we do it, the more we can learn to trust what's coming, because it's also tested. The accuracy of our of our intuition is tested in how the situation plays out in our lives. So the second point is a fundamental question that everyone faces every day, especially those of us who want to meditate. How do we calm the monkey mind? How often do we sit down to meditate? We're really happy to meditate. We've done our chanting, we've done our preparatory exercises, and we sit down and the mind takes off in a million directions. Oh, what am I going to do this afternoon? Oh, what am I going to make for lunch? Oh, I forgot to take care of this project, etc., etc. It's very frustrating. So, on this path, I'm very sorry that I have this little thing in my throat. On this path, Yogananda has given us the Hong Sa technique. And it's a very good technique. You observe the breath, you mentally repeat Hong Sa. But sometimes even doing Hong Sa, at least this is my experience, the mind will take off. So I learned a trick from one of the spiritual directors in Ananda, India, which is when we practice Hong Sa, to take a little pause after the exhalation and just relax. Not forcing anything. Yogananda said not to force the breath, but just to relax completely and let the breath stay out for a moment, as long as it wants to. if you're really relaxed, the breath doesn't come back until the body needs to inhale. And in that moment, when the body is perfectly still, the mind will tend to calm down. I have found this to be a very, very effective technique. And I'm a good example because, as I said, my mind is very restless and very active. If you don't know the Hong Sa technique, you can do the same thing just by observing your breath. And after every exhalation, just take that moment to be still and to feel the inner peace. Sometimes during Kriya or the Om technique or other techniques, maybe even techniques, if you do techniques from another path, even when you're in the middle of the technique, maybe the mind activates for some reason, maybe karma, who knows, and it starts firing and thinking. We have two choices in that case. One is to return for a moment to this Hong Sa, let's say extended Hong Sa, where we take that moment of pause after the exhalation. The other option, and I practice this too, and it's really effective, is just to offer those thoughts up to God. Yogananda taught us to be very spontaneous with God, with the Guru, with our inner relationship, to make them our friend, to relate to them like children, relating to their mother or their father. And I just say, okay, look at this. I see, you see, the mind is going crazy. I'm giving this to you, and I'm asking you to help me. I'm asking you to help me to still my mind. I'm asking you to help me purify whatever karma it is, because it's a karmic thing that's making these thoughts come out. I'm giving it to you. What is it? One of the phrases in the Bhagavad Gita, if in all of these things your faint heart fails, give me your failure. Okay, Lord, in this moment, I'm not succeeding to still the mind, so I'm giving you the restless mind. And this brings me to my last point, which may be perhaps the most important, the need for attunement. Yogananda gave great emphasis to the importance of attunement, especially when he was talking with his intimate, close disciples. He constantly brought it up. Tune into my consciousness, tune into God, develop your intuition. There's one last point that in the path that Kriyananda gives in the path. When Yogananda was helping Walter develop devotion, and Kriyananda writes, where is it? Here. Nightly I chanted Master's translation of a song by the great Bengali saint Ram Prasad. He knew that chanting is a wonderful way to develop devotion. Will that day come to me when saying, Mother, Mother, my eyes will flow tears. Gradually I found myself becoming transformed inwardly. I began to feel that I had some cause for self-congratulation. Until one day word came to me. The Master had been talking with a group of monks in Encinitas. During the course of the conversation, he had remarked lovingly, "Look how I have changed Walter. Look how I have changed Walter. Look how he has changed us, all of us. All of our spiritual efforts, the practices, the techniques, the prayer, the chanting, they're all necessary because they help us to tune the radio of our mind, of our consciousness, to the Yogananda channel, to the Divine Mother channel. This is the way to attract that grace, but it's the grace of God. It's the grace of the Guru that ultimately transforms our consciousness. A final technique in the moment of silence, after we've done our techniques, all of the techniques, Master says to enjoy the peaceful after effects of the techniques. That is the moment that we can really open ourselves to that transforming grace and to pray with deep concentration and conviction, come to me, Divine Mother, Master, Guruji, any one of the masters, come to me, reveal thyself. Help me to find God. I'd like to close with one little brief quote from the book, The Essence of Self-Realization. To tune into the Guru's consciousness, visualize him in the spiritual eye. Mentally call to him there. Imagine his eyes especially gazing at you. Invite his consciousness to inspire your own. Then, after calling to him for some time, try to feel his response in your heart. The heart is the center of intuition in the body. It is your radio receiver. Once you feel an answer in the heart, call to the Guru deeply. Introduce me to God. Thank you for your attention, and God bless you.